Alright, now we're going to get into Cold Wars, Part 3. After World War II, the globe was divided. The industrialized capitalist states of the First World competed against the largely industrialized communist states of the Second World. And this competition would dominate the affairs of these two geopolitical foes, as well as everybody else, the Third World, for decades to come. In January 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower was sworn in as President of the United States. 3 months later, Stalin died, likely of a stroke. He had built a cult of personality around himself, using media and propaganda to show him as a godlike leader. However, Stalin left behind a terrible legacy of totalitarian and communist control. Millions of people lost their lives due to his purges, his policies of forced collectivization and industrialization, as well as his draconian denial of civil liberties. In 1955, after a power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new premier. In his speech at Moscow, he told the West, "We will bury you." However, he generally sought a peaceful coexistence with the West. Khrushchev also denounced Stalin's brutal tactics. He worked toward de-Stalinization, reducing some of Stalin's most oppressive policies. For instance, he allowed some privatization and released thousands of political prisoners from the Gulag labor camps. The Cold War was a competition between two worlds trying to outdo the other in terms of political and economic influence, military might, as well as technological innovation. And perhaps nothing highlighted the competition of the minds better than the space race. In October 1957, the Soviet Union took the lead when they launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite launched by man, using a Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile. Sputnik did little more than relay a beeping sound back to the Soviet Union. But if they could launch a satellite into orbit, they could also launch a nuclear missile anywhere on the planet in a matter of several minutes. Now, the Soviets, like the Americans, used the rocketry research taken from the Germans to propel their programs forward. A month later, and the Soviet Union launched a larger satellite into orbit with a dog aboard. Unfortunately, the dog died in space. Now, the Americans were the first to launch monkeys into outer space. However, the Soviet Union once again took the lead in 1961 by sending the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. In that same year, President John F. Kennedy set the moon as a national goal.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And on July 20th, 1969, the Americans arguably won the space race with the lunar landing. Neil Armstrong made the famous first step.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The space race forced both sides to devote their best minds to the competition, and this race led to many new technological developments, ranging from smoke detectors and fog-resistant goggles to cordless tools and modern computers. Politically speaking, the Stormy Sixties ushered in a decade witnessing an escalation of tensions between the superpowers. In May 1960, the U-2 incident occurred. Not that one. A US spy plane was shot down over Soviet airspace. Now, both sides spied on each other, but the US got its hands caught in the cookie jar, so to speak. Summit talks for reducing nuclear arms between Khrushchev and Eisenhower ended in shambles. The Soviet leader was incensed. Months later, when he was at the UN, he pounded his shoe on his desk, furious at how the Soviet Union was depicted by Western states. Adding to the escalation, in August 1961, construction of the Berlin Wall had begun. The goal was to stop defections, or flows of emigrants from East Berlin to West Berlin. At that time, around 2 million had defected by way of Berlin. This image here shows a German soldier leaping to his freedom. The wall became a focal point of the Cold War for almost 3 decades.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred. To give some background, in 1959, Fidel Castro emerged victorious in his revolution in Cuba, and he enacted many communist reforms. For instance, taking land away from many private owners and redistributing it to the people. This caused a massive emigration out of Cuba and into the United States, many making their way to Miami, Florida. Castro also increased his ties with the Soviet Union, who was extremely interested in expanding its communist influence in the Western Hemisphere. In 1961, the CIA had trained over 1,400 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and start an uprising. However, the invasion failed and many of the exiles were captured. Some were executed, but most were eventually released. This was an embarrassment for the United States. But it would be a 13-day standoff between the superpowers over Cuba that would bring the world to the brink of World War III. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the US was far ahead of the Soviet Union in the arms race, having produced far more ICBMs than the Soviet Union. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. In 1962, Soviets secretly installed several mid-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, the US had installed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy aimed at Moscow. Nonetheless, in early October 1962, the US discovered the missiles in Cuba. This gave the Kremlin, the Soviet government, a first strike capability, meaning they could potentially strike Washington, D.C. and other important targets in the US before a counterstrike could be launched. They also potentially had intercontinental range ballistic missiles, which would have been able to hit every major city in the US, with the exception of Seattle. To avoid more missiles from entering Cuba, the US enacted a quarantine, stopping any Soviet ships from entering Cuban ports. What ensued was a 13-day standoff with warning shots fired between ships, tense negotiations, and even an American U-2 plane being shot down, killing the pilot. However, cooler heads prevailed, and Khrushchev eventually backed down, agreeing to remove the missiles from Cuba. In turn, the US agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy 6 months later. Although this has been disputed, many regard this event as the closest the world has ever come to World War III. Khrushchev was eventually forced to resign in 1964, primarily due to a power grab by the new premier, Leonid Brezhnev, who took power in 1965. He was more of a hardliner compared to Khrushchev. However, Brezhnev was still a far cry from the totalitarian tyrant that Stalin was. In 1968, Alexander Dubček, a newly appointed leader of Czechoslovakia, began to enact what he called socialism with a human face. He allowed for many democratic reforms, and promised civil liberties such as a greater freedom of expression. He also tolerated political and social organizations outside of communist control. This period of time was known as the Prague Spring. However, 6 months later, Brezhnev sent Warsaw troops into Czechoslovakia, killing around 100 people. He replaced Dubček and other reformers with pro-Soviet leaders. This solidified the Brezhnev Doctrine, stating that if a communist state drifted toward capitalism, it would be a problem for all communist states. This policy justified their desire to maintain Soviet hegemony inside the Eastern Bloc countries. Essentially, this was a policy of containment, opposite that of the US, assailing the spread of capitalism wherever they could. In contrast to the harsh repression as well as the economic and political struggles of the Soviet Union, the European Union formed out of a cooperative and capitalist effort by free nations. In 1944, even before the end of World War II, Benelux was formed, establishing a supranationalist agreement between Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And you can see its flag right here. Its initial goal was to reduce tariffs, eliminate quotas, and increase their wealth through a larger trading area. In 1957, Benelux joined with France, Italy, and West Germany to form the Common Market, also with the primary goal of establishing a larger trading bloc, and to increase cooperation between them. And in 1993, this Common Market grew into the EU, the European Union, and they introduced a common currency in 1999, the euro. Today, 18 of the 28 EU members have adopted the euro as their official currency. The EU is a patchwork of states with different traditions, ethnicities, and goals, and many Europeans are concerned over losing their national identities. Also, accepting new candidates for membership, such as the Ukraine or Turkey, has been complicated. For example, Germany is the strongest economy in Europe, and under the rules of the EU, the richer countries must subsidize the poorer ones. The entry of states with weaker economies would put additional stress to stronger ones. Nonetheless, the European Union is a potential superpower with over 500 million people, vast resources, and one of the strongest economies in the world.
Before you die, there is something you should know about us, Lone Star.
What?
I am your father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate.
What's that make us?
Absolutely nothing.